Serving this one, but I welcome Bob, and thanks very much for the chat we had before the meeting. And on my left, Nick Bell, but this isn't your first, is it?
It's my second chair.
Okay, all right then. Good. And we have apologies from Councillor Smith, and Councillor Tim Griffin is the substitute. But and thank you. Do thank Simon for making sure that you were able to come along. We've got a busy agenda. My aiming point is to try and conclude it all by 1 o'clock. Short time for lunch, and then at 1:30 we'll have a development session on financial matters, which will last about an hour and a half. But we can do all that earlier if we get through the business expeditiously. Okay. I need to jiggle with the... and I should have said, of course, the most important thing, the mayor is joining us. That's all right, because you're going to be a small way down the agenda. If you're not time critical... well, even better. Okay, thank you very much. So I need to jiggle around with the agenda a bit because the shareholder board, the single assurance framework and then the procurement review report, which is item 11, will now become after item 6. And that's because PwC will be joining remotely. So I think as the mayor is with us all the time, I don't need to worry about other timings on the agenda as long as we get through them in a good way. So I'd like to move on to item 2, which is the election of a vice chair. At the AGM, the board appointed me again as the independent chair and asked us to select our vice chair. And I put a note out, and I wondered if I had a proposer for anybody. A rush. Who would like it? Jeff.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'd like to propose Councillor Graham Wilson.
Yes, I'll second that.
Okay, and then the second, item 3 is the co-option of an independent member. For the last 3 years, the Combined Authority Board has put the offer on the table for both overview and scrutiny, and A&G to decide whether or not they wish to consider the co-option of an independent member from a constituent council. And if we were to do that, the co-optee, of course, would have no voting rights. This is a matter for members to decide. Would anybody like to give me some advice? Graham.
There we go. I think we all seem to be having problems this morning. I don't think we've had an independent member previously, certainly not in my time. And I'm aware that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee doesn't have an independent member. The paper talks about some other committees in other authorities having independent members, implying not everybody does. The difficulty I have is understanding precisely what the board were expecting to get from an independent member. Because independent members are exactly that. They're supposed to be independent of any party, a political party, and trying to find somebody who is representative of the public outside of a political party across the whole of Cambridgeshire would be extremely difficult. they will tend to be fairly parochial in their outlook, thinking about the St Neots independents, or with due respect, I don't know much about them, the Peterborough independents. There are some independents who stand in Huntingdon for the county council, but even they tend to be looking primarily at their local divisions or wards. So I'm not yet convinced that there are benefits for us, and I don't see how we would find somebody who was truly independent, who was a sitting councillor. If we wanted an additional member, then my view is we should be looking into the wider world and find somebody who could give us advice on audit and governance. So a bit like JP, who's come from an entirely independent past, who has expertise in those ideas, who could give us further thoughts rather than somebody from a party. But that's just my views, and I'd be interested in the views of the board as to why they think it might be appropriate.
There we are. Lovely. Only 7 presses. Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to sort of reflect on our experience in Peterborough in our own audit committee, where we have appointed independent members who are not independent councillors, but come with very significant experience from the banking sector and from academia. They've provided a really strong, resilient level of support and challenge, and assisted members in their ability to deliver true scrutiny around the audit function. So I think I'm with Graham on this one, is that if you're talking about an independent member who is independent yet expert and can come from anywhere around the country, and something where you can benefit from their really good experience and their ability to be extremely challenging sometimes, and to come from a different mindset but very familiar with finance, it's really good for us. I think I also concur with Graham that there are a number of independents, some more independent-minded than others. It'd be very hard to find someone who could be representative truly across all of the different independent groups. So my advice would be, let's go for a truly independent member with expertise, rather than someone who comes from, I think as Graham said, a more parochial perspective in their own wards. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Mayor?
I'm on. I just realised, I guess I'm the representative of the board here. So I probably should say as to kind of where this is coming from. I think it was born of a understanding in terms of how the combined authority is changing. And indeed the area it represents is changing in terms of political makeup. I'm obviously a proud Labour and Cooperative member, but I appreciate many around this table represent other parties. And I think it was an acknowledgement certainly from the majority of the board, that actually independent it might not have a direct political party status, but it is something that is reflected increasingly across different areas of the county. So, it was really from that point of view, there are, particularly if you in this very chamber where I previously sat as a district councillor, the independent group is actually kind of the biggest in terms of the political makeup of the alliance. The independent group at county council level, I know that's a slightly different thing, has an important role in that Rainbow Alliance. And I think it was a sense of inclusivity, or something is maybe the right phrase to use, about there are people who made decisions, be it at district council and county council level, and indeed city council level in Peterborough, who have expressed that they want a representative who is independent. I agree with you, Graham. The challenges of finding an independent is a big one, and maybe that's something that would need to be explored to avoid the kind of potential regionalism that could come with that label. But I guess I'm speaking on its, for this proposal, for you to consider it in whatever form you feel possible. And I guess taking on the other idea of an independent member from around the country, and it would be a question to you, Edwina, could an independent sitting councillor on a board be classed as an independent member? An independent person? Are they allowed to apply if there was some sort of application to be an independent non-voting member of the committee, if they had political office elsewhere as an independent, would that preclude them from standing in it? It's a bad day at the office at the moment. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Unintentionally.
Yeah. Sorry, so I understand your question. Your question is whether an independent councillor on the board, on the CA board, can apply.
Start again. There's a suggestion that I think what you're talking about in Peterborough, there's an independent appointment. Okay, it could come from around the country, but I'm just saying if somebody who was actually an independently elected councillor around the whole of Cambridgeshire, be in the county council, be it St Neots, could they, if there was a role created on the Audit and Governance Committee, still apply to it if they had a councillor office as an independent, but could they then still apply to the role? Or would the fact that they were elected official preclude them from standing? Or, I don't know.
Right, so for this role, that is before the ENG committee, the independent members, yes, an independent councillor could apply for this role, but they would not be representing the constituent council. They would basically be an independent member like any member of the public, which is why I think the comments have come from Councillor Wilson and Councillor Coles about how independent is an independent councillor. I hope I answered that question.
Mark.
Oh, first time. Okay. So I've just been listening to the arguments, and I think on the one hand, I do actually, I had the same thought that so Councillor Wilson said. I don't know if we do first name or second name, but or Graham said, because I think it is more difficult to see, let's say, the different independent groups across the county as a coherent group. On the other hand, it is, hearing what Nick was saying, if we look across all of the districts now and at the county as well, increasingly independent councillors are forming parts of administrations and so on, and more significant in Peterborough and Cambridgeshire than they have been. I also think if you reflect on something like, if you look at the LGA, for example, as well as the party political groups, they do have an independent group. I imagine the opinions are more diverse than in the average party political group. I think quite often, even in parties, you see quite diverse views. So I think on balance, given what Nick was saying, I'm minded to trial that and see how that works. And I don't think that excludes us also having, presumably, if we wanted to have let's say a position for an independent expert, as it were, the two are mutually exclusive proposals. So I guess at some point we could consider that as a separate proposal. But in terms of the proposal that we've got before us, I think on balance, I think it's because of the significance of independent councils now in the combined authority area, I think I'd be minded to support it.
Yes, thank you for that. Can I just check if members did decide to have an independent, co-opted, non-voting, how would that person be selected?
So in the report itself, I believe it sets out, I would just, there is a process, but it's going to be transparent, and I'm just trying to find the process in there, but there is.
Sorry, it was my fault. So you can stop.
Yeah, 2.3, thank you.
Yes, I hadn't picked up the 2.3. There would be a process and volunteers would be asked for. If I will come back, if I may, to another independent membership, not this proposal, but the comment about independent people on the audit committee, because when we come to the improvement item, but You will have all read, I know, what was sent around the sit for position statement on audit committees where they recommend 2 independents. So I think that's a debate for later on in the agenda. What we have is we have an offer of a trial. I think we need to just put this to the vote. Would members wish this year to have a co-opted member, perhaps to be looked at as a trial opportunity, or not? So can somebody, I'm never very good at voting rules. What are the rules? Does somebody need to propose, or can I just ask for yes or no?
As I suggested that idea, I'm happy to propose it formally as so that we can vote on it.
Right. Well, that's very interesting discussion and helpful. Sorry, Mr. Okay. We've had very short shrift in the previous 2 years when this item has come up, so it's good to have had a debate about it. I think that's very helpful. Okay, so let's move on to Chair's announcements. I have a few. The draft accounts are delayed because of difficulties with the pension inputs that we need. So they will come to the next meeting, all being well. Number 2, members will have hopefully seen the email about the induction day on the 22nd of June in Peterborough for all members. This is part of the improvement journey and trying to bring more and more people into the same understanding. So that's, and substitutes are also welcome. So I would ask you to attend if you can, and certainly encourage your substitutes to attend. So it's the 22nd of June, 9 a.m. in University House at Anglia Ruskin University. And there are advice about parking and all of that. Some of us were able to attend the induction yesterday for the A&G for the new year. It was put together by officers. It was recorded, and Anne will make it available. And I would very much encourage both those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday and your substitutes to find the time. I don't know whether Mark wanted to say anything as he was fresh to the committee and attended.
I knew briefly that I find it very useful and very informative, and I think, as we said at the end, I think it'd be very useful to share that with all members and substitute members who the recording who weren't able to attend. So appreciate the preparation time that went into that. I certainly found it useful.
Okay, right. So that was that concludes my announcements, and so we will now go on to the minutes of the previous meeting and the action log. Are we happy to take the minutes as an accurate record? And I'll take that they're agreed then. I have the action log, which you may not have spotted because it was a late paper, but it was the bottom of the agenda. But actually, good news, it's only 2 pages, and there are only 2 items that concern us today. One will be picked up later under the shareholder item, shareholder board item, and I just ask the monitoring officer to give a verbal update on the extent to which the recommendations Audit and Governance made on the Constitution were accepted by the board of the Combined Authority.
Thank you, Chair. I can confirm that all the recommendations made by the E&G Committee was adopted by the board at its meeting on March 31st. And all those comments or recommendations will find their way into the Constitution. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. I'm getting better at it. So that's good news. And for those who, we did agree at the end of last year that the Anne and her team will now track all the recommendations that we make within the combined authority, so that we get an insight as to the extent to which they're accepted, or we get feedback as to why not. And we had the first attempt at that in our report, which was very reassuring, because it is important that when we do make recommendations that they're properly considered. And that has been the situation so far. Right. We can now go on to the single assurance framework, which Jodie Townsend should be somewhere on the Zoom. Jodie?
Good morning, Chair.
Okay, we can't see you, but
Hopefully you can hear me.
we can hear you. Okay, so I don't know, do you want to kick off straight away with this paper, or are you going to say anything, Nick? Jodie, okay, the floor is yours, Jodie, even though we can't.
Thank you, Chair, and hopefully I'll get the video working as we go through the items. So the purpose of this report is to keep the Governance Committee up to speed on the project to develop a single assurance framework, asking you to note to provide comments on the timeline for its development. I've previously been to the committee on 2 occasions, I believe, to speak about the concept of developing the assurance framework as part of the improvement framework conversations. The report sets out what the single assurance framework that we refer to as the staff will cover. It also sets out the design principles that we have been requested to develop the staff against. These follow engagement with the mayor, all council leaders, and all regional council chief executives. We're working toward 2 specific CA board decision points. Those being July, corporate prioritisation approach and project approval thresholds. And on the 20th of September, the single assurance framework document in its entirety with an implementation plan.
Jodie, can I just put, we're getting some feedback. I don't know whether, I don't think it'll be this end, so. Oh, it's the quality of the internet connection, so you're forgiven, but maybe a bit slower.
Yes, Chair, noted. I would try to speak a little slower. Give me a wave if you need me to speak even slower. So the reason for splitting the approvals is to ensure we align with other improvement work being undertaken within the CA.
The account will
in regards to scheme of
by next week, then it's worth waiting for that to happen and for the interest amounts to be correct.
I think we may have another participant who has their microphone on.
Well, there's nobody at this end apart from me at this moment.
Okay.
I'm looking at the technical advice and he's bewildered.
Apologies, that was me joining with my microphone on. I've switched it off now.
Thank you, Chair. I'll continue. So the SAF is going to require DLUC clearance. Engagement has already begun with the appropriate DLUC contacts on the clearance process, with the precedent for the sign-off process now covered by the new English Devolution Accountability Framework, which was published by government in March. I believe we are going to be the first CA to go through this process. There are 3 engagement groups in place to support the SAF development process that we have set up. They consist of an internal working group, which consists of key officers across CA business areas, an external working group, which consists of key officers from across all of the constituent councils identified by their chief executives. And we have an M10 assurance group. This is the group of mayoral combined authorities, 10 mayoral combined authorities, their lead assurance officers, who are advising on some of our development steps and looking to obviously take on and help us develop best practice. I present the update to the committee and I'm happy to answer questions and I'm hopeful that you can still hear me.
Thank you, Jodie. Yes, we could hear you fine. Comments, questions, members?
I was really looking just for a little bit more maybe explanation on the diagram that's shown in 2.12, because I was having a little bit of difficulty interpreting, because if I look at it, I guess I'm sort of looking at it as if it was a Gantt chart, but that seems to show that we're initiating, developing and delivering all at the same time. And I'm trying to understand what we're showing in terms of the sequence of those events and what that maybe it's an offline discussion to have. I think it would be useful to have something that looks more like a sort of Gantt chart where you can see which phase happens when, because it's not clear to me if we've got gates that need to be passed before you can move, for example, from the sort of pre-initial phase to initial phase and development, which is what the sort of flow I'd normally expect to see.
Yeah, if I can answer that question. So firstly, apologies for the smallness of the diagram. I thought I'd landscape these. Apologies. The diagram you're referring to sets out each phase that we are developing. So this is not necessarily how the SAF is going to work. This is how we're developing the content for the new single assurance framework. And we've set out in this process so that we can then engage DLUC to make sure they are happy that we are meeting the requirements in each of those phases as we go through and develop them. We'll then get to the point in September where we'll propose a new single assurance framework document with supporting process, criteria, templates, etc. to the board, obviously going via this committee in early September, alongside an implementation plan for then how that will be phased in to replace the existing assurance framework. So as you've set out, Councillor, you would expect obviously in the assurance framework there to be an entry point into SAF with that pre-initiation phase, prioritisation into initiation, and then into your business case development stages, moving on to approval and subsequent delivery phases as well. That diagram is specifically in regards to the elements we're developing in regards to content. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Thanks, John. On page 14, there's a very helpful flow chart showing the movement of information. I couldn't see where risks were assessed and whether that's assumed within different elements or covered separately. I'm not really clear. And then there must ultimately be some form of feedback loop. And I would have said it's not simply from contract completion, but it's implementation of all these things, lots of different things which the combined authority is doing. It subsequently leads to data and learning, changes to objective setting, and changes to the state of the region. So two questions really. One is the circle complete in the way it's written, and where does risk management fit in? Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, you are right in regards to risk is obviously embedded into various phases within the single assurance framework. I would expect risk to be a key component within the strategic objective setting, within the pre-qualification, early door assessments, and very heavily then from initiation and then obviously into business case development. We'll obviously be looking to make sure we meet HMT Green Book requirements, of which of course there are many in regard to risk, but we'll be making sure hopefully that we are delivering those proportionately depending upon the level of approval and complexity of each project that is put forward. In regards to the feedback loop, I absolutely agree with you, Councillor. There is data and learning to be picked up on everything that the CA is doing, and we're looking to develop ways that we get this data up and not just use it, but also report it in a sort of a live way to our members throughout the year, as it is a key tool that this committee, Overview and Scrutiny, and others could potentially use moving forward.
Thank you, Chair. Jodie, I'm just taking up that final point. I was just wondering whether you could overlay when Audit and Governance or Oversight and Scrutiny would have a particular view in these steps in that particular diagram, because I think it's very useful to know how things develop, but obviously we're going to be drawing our work from the projects as they go forward. Is it possible to produce this, including potential points when Oversight and Scrutiny and this particular committee should be getting involved in scrutinising, please?
Chair, if I may, yes, I'd be happy to produce an illustration that shows, as we're referring to them as our governance plugins. So where we're producing information that will feed tools that you can use, and where we would expect to come to various governance boards, committees, etc., with approvals, decision making, update, reporting, performance challenge, etc. More than happy to do that and send that to you following the meeting.
Thank you. That's a new phrase. We have a governance plug-in. I'm going to live with that. Nick Bell wants to say something. This one works.
Great, thank you. My apologies on that one. Mine does seem to be working. Just a couple of comments, if I may. The first of which is that later on today's agenda, you'll see there's an update on the performance report and the performance reporting framework that we're developing. And obviously, there's a clear link between the development of the single assurance framework and that performance reporting as well. So that, I think, answers some of the questions that have come from members of the committee. The other thing to bear in mind is the single assurance framework links very closely to a couple of other things. One is the improvement programme that Angela Probert will be talking about a little bit later on today. And then also to another report on your agenda today later on, which is the delegations, and looking at the scheme of delegations as well through there. So actually, you can't see the single assurance framework as something that stands in isolation. It's actually part of that wider framework that we're developing in terms of approvals, monitoring, reporting, and learning as part of that virtuous cycle that comes from that. So hopefully members of the committee find that helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I don't see any other. Oh, the Mayor would like to speak.
I'll keep it short. I've obviously, first of all, want to acknowledge the incredible work that Jodie's been doing over the last year and a half, and also many other officers, senior officers who've come into the organisation. I think people realise that I've been away from the organisation. I arrived here back very enthused 3 months ago, and can only just say how delighted I was when this was sort of presented to me as what was going on as part of the improvement strategy, simply because I said, why didn't we have one before? And secondly, oh, is that what we do? And that's kind of where I am, because I think, although I'm sure the nuances and obviously the expertise from the audit committee here can play into it, this immediately made sense to me, and and I can only just thank the team enough, because it kind of re-emphasised the kind of organisation that the combined authority can become, working with its constituent members in a sort of symbiotic relationship. And the one thing which I know is in it's got a dotted line there, but at the side, and is one thing I really do hope that in the course of time will become part of the bigger picture for the combined authority, is the concept of that the combined authority will present a sort of annual state of the region update, where we can demonstrate what we've been achieving and what we can achieve going forward. It's without any doubt that there is huge opportunity coming forward in terms of the national picture around devolution, and I know this was something that's been discussed with members at the board, and there is this all the shoulder to the grindstone is already there in terms of engagement with all constituent members. But going forward with devolution in whatever form that is, and in lots of cooperation, knowing that there is something as an SAF explaining what we're going to be doing on an annual basis and having the appropriate rigour and oversight, I only wish I'd had it when I'd arrived. And so I'm very grateful for the work that's been done on this, and I really do commend it, and I'm grateful for the further input from yourselves to make sure that we get it right.
I am on, sorry. As a follow-up point that touches on what the Mayor said, we had previously the assurance framework, which has been through this committee many times, and we now find that it was not best practiced and was wanting. Were we, as an Audit and Governance Committee, wanting, Or, I mean, should we have seen that? And I always am slightly nervous when we get a watch. I can't remember how long the governance statement was, but it's 40 pages or something. That something comes to us, we do the best we can and take a view. But should we have seen this earlier? Should the combined authority have seen this earlier, that we were lacking this approach? Jodie?
My response to that would be to say that the previous LAF, as it was, local assurance framework, was deemed to be adequate and working in some circumstances. It's just that we identified initially through the review of governance, and then with wider engagement with other mayoral combined authorities, there were areas where we made some significant improvements. And things are moving on quite considerably at the moment in regards to SAFs around the country. So the SAF development, for example, in the Northeast has played a significant role in their devolution discussions and agreement, and there's lots we picked up on that. And of course, assurance frameworks are now heavily referred to in the English devolution accountability framework as a way to ensure accountability, local scrutiny, and good governance. So my view would, I would also add to that, sorry, just a reminder that you did also feed in during the review of governance and in the early improvement framework development stages some comments to me about how perhaps we could develop some of the processes around our assurance framework to make sure we were providing, as I referred to earlier, those appropriate governance plugins. So I would also add, I think it's a role for this committee to have a regular or an annual review process in regards to the assurance framework, and maybe seeking some views of those users about how usable it is, particularly our constituent authority colleagues, and them accessing the entry points and putting in business cases and seeking obviously bid support. So I believe that is the case at other American authorities, that they have an annual review process. Maybe there's some best practice that we could go away and get from for you from the other mayoral combined authorities through the M10 assurance group about how they undertake that annual check and balance process and report it back.
Thank you, Jodie. That's very, very helpful and reassuring. Before we close,
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've had similar thoughts really. I suppose any assurance framework, that there will be ways to sort of circumvent or subvert, if, not suggesting that anyone would want to do that, but how would we, who's sort of watching the watchers, if you like? And I wondered, I was looking sort of ahead in the agenda to the internal audit plans for 23-24, and it doesn't specifically reference the single assurance framework, and although it probably covers the same things, I wondered if it should, but maybe that's for later in the agenda.
Chair, if I may, I mean, the assurance framework will pick up obviously within its 3 lines of defence approach, making sure that as well as within business area, there is outside business area assurance and external assurance within the process. What we're also looking to do to strengthen the robustness of the assurance framework is by specific consideration criteria to the various groups that will be involved in approvals. We are looking around the idea of creating a technical officer group, which we found is standard within other mayoral combined authority single assurance frameworks, where they have a focus on technical challenge around the 5-case model, and they then give technical advice and assurance to the political decision-making bodies when they are approving projects and programs, which allows those politicians to, as well as have that additional technical assurance, to really focus their approach on political and strategic fit considerations, making sure that what they're approving fits within what the CA is going to look to attempt to achieve, is in line with its corporate plan, and that the benefits are deliverable. So hopefully that picks up on your answer on your question, but happy again, like I said, to pick up any of this outside the meeting, or even have one-to-one conversations with anyone to explain the assurance framework in more detail, as it is a very large project and document.
thank you, Jodie. On my left.
Thank you. I just wanted to reassure the committee, while there isn't anything specifically referencing the single assurance framework in the internal audit plan, there is actually currently underway a audit on the budget setting process, which includes how projects and programs are included in the capital program and within the revenue budget. That would pick up, have they appropriately followed through the governance steps in the local assurance framework, or what will be the single assurance framework, to ensure we are going through those steps. So it may not reference the SAF specifically, but those checks are within the audit plan.
Thank you very much. Well, very helpful as usual. Okay, Jodie, we're next due to see this on its way to the board on the 8th of September. And if you are able to provide us, when we look at it then, with some insights as to how these plans are scrutinised elsewhere, the techniques they use, that would be very helpful. We are asked to note the report, which we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Was item 11, and it's at pages 57 to 107 in the document pack. It'll be introduced by Nick, but we will have online from PwC Rachel Thursfield and Lisa Weisener, or if I've pronounced that right, I hope, so that they can answer any questions we have. I hand over to Nick.
Thank you, Chair. So just a few opening comments, if I may, in relation to the report itself, particularly for those members of the Audit and Governance Committee who weren't members at the last meeting in March. Procurement was identified as an area of focus by both the external auditor and by DLUC as well, in relation to their improvement notices and improvement work that we were focusing on. So as part of that, to make sure that we had the right focus as an organisation around procurement, we agreed to commission a review from PricewaterhouseCoopers that was reported to the Audit and Governance Committee in March. And that review focused in particular around best practice and best value in procurement, looking at the way we develop our strategies, our policies, our operations and compliance in those individual areas. PricewaterhouseCoopers started that work towards the back end of March and early April. And as part of that work, they reviewed a large amount of data that we provided them with across the organisation, talked to a number of officers, significant number of officers, and also some members as well. And I believe Councillor Wilson from this committee was one of the people that PricewaterhouseCoopers talked to as part of that, together with other members of the authority. PricewaterhouseCoopers then produced their draft report in May, and that's now attached to the report as Appendix 1. And that covers 4 main areas of recommendation for us as an organisation. The first of which is to review and refine our operating model and to have clarity on that in relation to the way procurement operates. And they've provided us with some options in relation to that at slide 35 and slide 36 in the report itself. They're recommending that we refresh our contracts register, have a better mechanism to make sure our contracts register is in place and fully updated, so that all officers are aware when contracts are coming to their end or require updating around those areas. And once again, it's something that while we had some work in place around it, we haven't been as strong as we could be around those areas. The third one is about revising our procurement policy, our strategy and procedures to make sure they reflect best practice now and the potential implications of the procurement bill, which is going through government and will be in place next year. And the final one about implementing training for all officers across the combined authority on procurement and contract management. We've taken all of those on board and we're developing a detailed action plan that we will bring back to this committee probably in September in terms of the detailed action plan. But we felt that there were a number of areas and issues that were so important for us to prioritise. We wanted to pull together a high-level action plan of some of those for consideration today, and then final approval, hopefully, at the Combined Authority Board on the 26th of July. And they covered each of these 4 areas, and that's appended as Appendix 2 to the report. And basically, whichever operating model we decide upon, the issues that we're currently facing in relation to staffing within procurement are critical. We currently have one excellent officer in procurement, but she is alone in terms of handling a huge volume of work that we currently have. And ensuring that we have sufficient capacity to be able to do that is critical for us moving forward. So there's a recommendation in relation to that staffing. Similarly, we don't have anybody at the moment who can actually handle the contracts register and is dedicated to doing that, and we believe that we need to have that in play rapidly as well to be able to move the improvement forward. The third item and issue is that we're keen to revise the procurement policy as rapidly as we possibly can. And again, we've commissioned some work already to do that for us and to make sure that the procurement policy sits as an appendix to the Constitution. So when procurement law changes, we can amend that appendix rather than coming back and amending the whole Constitution. And the final one is to start to commission some training for all of the officers across the organisation to make sure that everybody has at least a basic understanding in relation to procurement and contract management that they need to have in place. So that's the high level action plan that is Appendix 2 to the report. However, there will be a more detailed action plan that comes forward, let's say, in September, once we've had the time to refine the issues and consider all of those areas for the operating model that PricewaterhouseCoopers have highlighted in their diagram on page 36 of the slide deck. So that's probably all I wanted to say at the moment in relation to introducing the report. But obviously we have both Rachel Thursfield and Lynn Wiesner here from PwC, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any of the detailed questions, but equally happy to answer myself any questions in relation to the high-level action plan. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dick. What we're asked to do before I open it for discussion is to recommend to the CA board the implementation of the high-level action plan and recommend to the CA board they approve the recruitment of additional officers. Now, that second one, I'd be interested in views. I'm not sure in my own mind to what extent that we should be able or have competence to explain to management what they need to do the job. So whilst we must, I hope we all welcome what the work that's been done on the proposals. I just think sticking to our role, I'd be interested in views as do you think we are the right group to be recommending staff changes? Yeah, well, Nick, before the...
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps if I could just clarify that point. I think the critical issue for me is about the opportunity for the Audit and Governance Committee to have an input into the recommendations that come in front. And given the fact that 2 of those recommendations are around capacity and staffing and linked very strongly to the PwC report, I felt it was maybe not a recommendation, but useful to have a discussion, perhaps at least, at Audit and Governance Committee in relation to how that flows through from the report itself. Obviously, it will be the main board in 26th of July that takes a final decision in relation to any additional staffing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. No, so comments, please.
Thank you, Chair. Nick, thanks very much. I have been sort of wrestling with this one because I appreciate you need a procurement process within the Combined Authority, but so many of the projects initiate from the constituent authorities who have their own procurement processes, and I don't quite see how that fits in. It may well be that you require procurement staff direct within the Combined Authority when actually a lot of the work is done outside, and how one deconflicts that and can recognise that this genuinely is required within the Combined Authority is something I'd like to see, because it's a little bit obscure for me at the moment. I'd be grateful for an explanation about that, if you would.
Thank you. Very happy to pick that one up. It's you're quite right that obviously the Combined Authority in many occasions uses constituent councils in terms of actually delivery of a number of the projects. But in many other areas, it goes directly. So, for instance, if we look at some of the skills work that we do through the adult education budget and the skills boot camps, etc., they're commissioned directly through a number of different providers. And one of the things that we're keen to do is to develop a better procurement system called a dynamic purchasing system to enable that to happen, which will be a critical issue for us. And once again, we have not had the capacity to be able to do that. But even in those areas where we do rely on, the good support that we get from the constituent councils to deliver, many of which are in our transport area, there we still need to make sure that we have the right focus in terms of the grant requirements that we then provide to the constituent councils for the grant funding agreements. And again, as part of that, we need to make sure that we have close linkages between the work we do as a combined authority when we pass that funding out with the right mechanisms in terms of delivering the project to the procurement areas within the individual constituent councils. So it's trying to avoid duplication, because that's critical to make sure the public money is used effectively and once, but at the same time making sure that we have a good control mechanism in place, both for those areas that we procure directly and for those areas where we provide grant funding agreements to constituent councils to do that work. Hopefully that helps to explain the differential there.
Yes, so I talking about, well, I think it was useful to start with. When I read the report, it wasn't clear to me, or the context in terms of the high-level action plan wasn't very clear to me, because I think that the PwC report is very good, and I have some, I can see good justifications for the recommendations they're making, but they're really quite broad and high level, and clearly you need a detailed action plan. So I appreciate you explaining that is the sort of next step that you need to develop that. What concerns me, I guess, if I take one example in the report, it recommends that that the authority needs to determine an operating model. It gives 3 examples, but obviously that you could have other examples or a hybrid of those. If I then move to the high-level action plan and we start to recruit people, it's not clear to me whether we've identified which model we're going for. And on the one hand, I can see from, for example, the guidance that we CIPS guidance that we've got shows that we're woefully short in terms of staffing on procurement. So I can see there's a need there to urgently address that. What concerns me is if we haven't got that action plan together that says this is the model that we're going to go down and this is what we want to adopt, there's a danger that we rush to try and fill that gap, and we don't necessarily have the right job descriptions, the right and the right roles to staff that. So could you clarify on where you are on that sort of operating model?
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of the operating model, our preference at the moment is to go down number 2, which is a hub and spoke model. That's a model that certainly I've worked with in other organisations, and I think certainly PwC. I think that in our context may be the most helpful. So this is effectively where we end up with business partners who support the 3 directorates. They have a close link into, a very close link into the central procurement function, but they each have a link directly. So there'll be one for the transport and connectivity area, one for economy and skills, and one for the corporate centre, and which works with the Greater South East Net Zero Hub as well, each of which have got significant procurement issues. However, we need to do some further, more detailed work to refine that through. I think it's worth saying that from our perspective at the moment, the completely devolved model, their Model 1, is probably not going to work for us given our context that we've been in, because we've had that to a degree already in place and it's not functioned effectively for us as an organisation. The one which is complete tight control, effectively, which is operating model 3, is a possibility. But the reason I'm suggesting some initial staffing to come in is those staff that we would appoint under recommendation 1 of the high-level action plan, if we then decided to move to operating model 3 rather than operating model 2, we can actually bring in and utilise within the central area, as opposed to effectively placing them in the directorates, which we would do under operating model 2. So that we've got the flexibility on that. But I think that the risk we carry as an organisation, if we don't start to address some of those issues sooner rather than later in terms of staffing, is quite significant. And therefore, that's why the action plan has the ability for us to be able to go out and resolve some of those issues sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we would need to wait to September, because it would take a while to develop the detailed operating model for us to start that. And I think those extra few months would carry a very significant risk.
So I think that was a very useful explanation. What I would say is I think if that Appendix 2 had sort of, it's almost like you've jumped to the conclusions of this is what we need to do. And I understand your feeling of urgency there, but I think it would benefit from having written down essentially what you just told us, because you've just taken us through your thinking to get to those actions. And I think our role more as a committee is to see whether, not deciding about staff appointments, but are you addressing, let's say, the recommendations from the PwC report in an appropriate way? And so verbally you're telling me, but I wasn't getting that from Appendix 2. I didn't ask, but I guess and I'm sure it's a contracts manager, not contracts manager, but in the second recommendation, again, if I look back to what we've got of the PwC report, that's clearly an area that needs urgent action. But again, I think it would be helpful for members if in reports like this we have this is the thought process that has led to this sort of recommendation.
Of course, my apologies to the committee if the report isn't sufficiently developed to reach that, and I'll try and make sure in the future that the reports that do come through have all that thinking in place as well.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, I'm speaking again on behalf of the board, and obviously with my mayoral hat on, I would obviously want to register my personal thanks for the external review, which is the first time I've had opportunity to sort of say that on public record to PwC. And again, sitting here today with the committee, I want to say how very pleased I am to see this, and indeed the recommendations as they are presented. I can only kind of highlight that I was elected in May 2021, and I was raising concerns around procurement within the organisation as soon as July 2021. The fact that we're now looking at the challenges that the previous procurement policies were facing, and I want to acknowledge, Nick, what you've highlighted, the work of one single procurement officer who I personally believe, and I have huge respect for, went above and beyond in trying to keep this organisation on track. And I want to make that as a public record. My point is that in the past, in other areas around the whole of the combined authority, there was a push maybe to kind of a lean, mean fighting machine. Well, that doesn't cut the mustard as far as I'm concerned. It never did. And I think there were quite clearly problems around procurement policies and indeed the way that they were delivered in the past. And the fact that we are, as part of improvement strategy, changing the organisation with these sorts of recommendations, with the benefit of an external review, I can only say that from the point of view of myself. Coming back into the organisation, the huge reassurance that I get from it. My personal observation is there's quite clearly a need for this high-level action plan. From my point of view, knowing what's gone on in the past, we need to have the level of recruitment. I am respectful of obviously the comments made as to how that should be done and what model, and I will obviously leave that to the experts in the room and you who are providing the scrutiny. But once again, I just want to thank the board. You collected here, the committee, for taking this forward. I do think that the board of the Combined Authority needs to hear a clear and strong voice of the importance of these recommendations. And if I was allowed to, I'd heartily recommend full recommendation and acceptance of these. Thank you.
There we go. Yes, it's referring back to Appendix 2 as well, around the question of staffing. It's to talk about their implementing procurement and contract management training. I just wondered how much of that training would negate the need for further recruitment of staff.
Thank you. I think, obviously, if we don't train at all, we'll need even more people to come in. I think the critical issue is to make sure that everybody understands within their roles what good procurement looks like, because really every single member of staff to a degree has a link in somewhere in terms of procurement. And what I think will happen is that we will still require the staffing levels I've identified in the high level staffing plan. But if we weren't to provide the training, we'd probably require more over and above that. So therefore, good training, I think, will negate the requirement for us to get in even more staff than is required. Than is in there. We're currently scoping out the training, and obviously want to make sure that that's got full approval before we then deliver it. But it will be important to make sure that is in place.
Thanks, JP. Two comments. One, Nick referred to the fact that I was one of the members who was interviewed by this. It was interesting to me when I asked all these detailed questions by PwC how little I knew about the details of the procurement function. And it goes back to your initial comment. I'm not sure whether that is actually a function of the committee anyway. We should be asking the high-level questions rather than getting involved in the details of staffing and other posts. But the main question is, as PwC are on the line, are they entirely comfortable that these high-level recommendations address all the issues that have been raised in their procurement review, which is extremely thorough and refreshing?
Did you hear that? Yeah. PwC?
Yeah, we heard that. Yeah, and I can say that we're content with how the action plan is looking. It'll be interesting to see the more detailed action plan when it's taken to the committee in September. But in terms of addressing those critical points in terms of recruitment, contract management, I think the authority's taken the right approach.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask one question whilst we have you on the screen. I mean, this is getting organised and recovering from a weak position. I didn't see anything there about monitoring the effectiveness. Now, numbers of contracts, numbers of single tender contracts and the like, and the number of suppliers. And is there anywhere in this where we will get a recommendation of the type of scrutiny information one can be provided to the audit committee so that we can see the behaviour of the system?
Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah. The contract register will be your key point of information. So as long as that remains updated and has all the detail of the contracts you've got in place, that includes who your suppliers are, how many SMEs are delivering your contracts, how many local suppliers are involved in your contracts. So that contract register in itself will be a key data point and a key reporting mechanism to show you how effective the recommendations and improvements are being made.
And Lynn, I'll just add to that. I think through the operating model isn't just about the structure or people, it's about how you work. So within the development of the operating model, you need to also look at what are those key performance indicators, what do you want to be reporting on to the various governance bodies.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I just may, I was about to make a very similar comment to the one that Rachel Firstfield just made from PwC, that we are developing a suite of KPIs, key performance indicators, and they will of course be reported back to this committee as part of the wider performance framework that we'll be talking about a bit later. But also to point out as well that internal audit will have a critical role in relation to looking at our procurement in the future. And I know that in discussion around when the first internal audit should be of the new procurement cycle, we're suggesting that it's towards even the back end of this year or into next year, by the time we've actually developed and embedded the action plan. So that will then be able to give this committee some assurance in terms of is the procurement operating effectively.
And Nick, when do you think it would be timely to bring back an update as to how things are going.
Thank you for that, Mayor Chair. I think in terms of the key performance indicators, you'll hear a little bit later on in the agenda. We're developing that performance report now, and I would think that we'll have that probably up and running by September for a general overview, but of course we won't have the procurement fully in place by then because of the action plan. I would think that by December, we'll be able to start to bring some initial indications through. But also later this financial year, most likely to be March, April time, maybe into the early next financial year, we'll have the audit as well, the internal audit coming through in terms of actually how we've implemented that and give you that assurance. So it's those couple of times, December for the key performance indicators, back end of this financial year or early next financial year for the assurance through internal audit.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more comments. Trying to sum up, I'm grateful, Nick, for you to take on the point of when we get things of this nature to try and characterise the thinking behind some of it in the response to that. I think we as a group can do nothing but strongly welcome the work that's being done, and the work is now that's in train, and I think we could commend the high-level action plan to the CA board. And I think on the question of resources, I think there can be no doubt in our minds, from what we've read and heard and seen, that there's not enough resource within the combined authority to do what needs to be done. But that is for the board and management to decide the quantification of that. But we do recommend that the board addresses the concerns regarding capacity. Are we happy with that? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Okay, so we're just over an hour in, so how far have we got? Now go back to the next item then is item 7, which is the shareholder framework. And if I may just summarise a bit about it before we ask the monitoring officer and then the mayor to bring us up to date. The fact the mayor talked about on procurement, he identified an issue which some time ago, which is now being addressed. Well, I asked officers to just remind me and us how long we've been on the journey of the subsidiary companies. And we first raised this in May 2020. And the topic has been brought to the committee in the last 3 years 7 times. And twice in our annual reports, we've asked for focus and said we would put focus on this topic because of the nature of the governance of subsidiary companies and the risks it entails. And I think with the benefit of hindsight now, we can say this was an indicator of some of the issues that the authority has been grappling with, which the improvement plan is all about fixing. And the fact that an audit committee laid down markers, but it's taken 3 years to reach this point. I think that's the past, and the future. We look for the combined authorities developing as they are, the capability to see these things as and action them sooner, get things done. So with that sort of cri de coeur, can I ask Edwina to introduce before the mayor talks to us?
Thank you, Chair. So the report before this committee is to provide an update on the shareholder board that was established by the CA board in November last year. So there are some members of the board, and I will just name them. So the mayor is the chair of the board. There are 3 representatives as well from the board for each political party. So there's Councillor Lynn Eyes, I hope I pronounced that correctly, from PCC, representing the Conservatives. There's Councillor Mike Davey from Cambridgeshire City Council, and he represents Labour. And then there's Councillor Lucy Netzinger from Cambridgeshire County Council, who represents the Lib Dem on the shareholder board. There is also the chief executive officer who is a member of the shareholder board, and there are officers who support the board regularly. I'm pleased to inform the committee that the first meeting of the shareholder board took place on Wednesday, and it was remote. It was a remote meeting, but that's because it's not a formal meeting as defined by the 1972 Act. The purpose of the shareholder board is to have to ensure proper governance of the subsidiary companies and to monitor performance and information from each subsidiary company. So what was agreed at the first meeting was that there will be regular updates brought to this committee so that you're fully aware of what's going on in the subsidiary companies. There are a few that to be closed down. So Angle Holdings and Angle East Developments, that's in the process of being closed down. But there is still Propco 1, Propco 2, and Growthco. So really, those would be the major companies. Also, we'll get onto audits in another item. However, I just wanted to reassure the board as well, or bring to the attention of the board, that the recent audit for the companies was a reasonable assurance from our internal auditors, but I believe more will be spoken about that in the next item dealing with audits. That's it, and I'm open to questions. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Mayor, I'm very grateful you're here today. Do you want to, now you've chaired your first board, would you like to bring it alive for us?
It was a remote meeting. I think there are sometimes when you become a mayor, you don't quite realise that what implications are. I think being the chair of a shareholders board was not one thing that I saw in the job description 2 years ago. All I would understand, I think, it has been very clearly articulated by Edwina as the monitoring officer. I think it's fair to say, my hand has been held, and the political representatives that were there at the board, we are well informed as to kind of what our role is going forward, and acknowledging what you said at the start about how this problem has come up several times, even before I was here in 2021. I'm just grateful that some sort of new, nuanced oversight in regard to this particular challenge of these companies that have been set up by the Combined Authority having the proper governance. Again, I'm here because I want to say I'm delighted to be part of it, and I will be chairing it accordingly. Thank you.
Comments from members?
Could Edwina or Nick clarify what is our role with this new, I think you described as informal meeting, or not a formal meeting, which may not be the same as an informal meeting, but how do we fit in? Because section 6.1 very helpfully lists the legal implications of us in overseeing responsibilities of the trading companies, but not of a shareholder board. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. So 2 things. As part of the shareholder board, you can attend as observers. So you can attend those meetings and make contributions to those meetings if you want, as a member of this committee. Also, you've said rightly that the Constitution places a duty on this committee to also have assurance regarding the subsidiary companies. So with the regular reports that come to this committee, you will be apprised of what's going on in the subsidiary companies. You can probe, you can ask questions, you can ask for further reports, you can ask to see any documents that will provide you with assurance that the companies have been run properly and efficiently. I hope that's answered your question. Or
Thank you. So maybe if I just add to what Edwina has said there, I think that the critical issue is to be aware the shareholder board is up and running, to receive regular feedback from the shareholder board to give you yourself assurance that actually the subsidiary companies are operating effectively and being well governed through there. And I think that sort of the attendance of that as observers can be a useful way of doing it, but also to note as well, I think the one thing that we discussed at the shareholder board that the mayor and the other members of that board agreed on Wednesday, which links back to actually a discussion you had earlier on this committee, was the appointment of 2 independent members with specialisms to the board, again, given the fact that the companies at the moment that we have, one is very much focused around property development for Peterborough University, and the other is focused more around how we help support businesses across the area. So we look for specialist independent people to come in with that knowledge to support the governance of the organisation as well. So I think that's the role is very much one of ensuring that you're assured by that shareholder board from the combination of the minutes, the combination of the reports back, and the combination of you being able to actually go and, if you wish, to observe what's happening there. Does that help? Thank you.
So I had a question and a comment, so I'll start with my question, and that is just following up on that, the ability of any member of this committee to attend shareholder meetings as an observer. So how does that work in practice? How we are made aware that those meetings are coming up, and if any of us do want to attend, how do we arrange that?
So that would normally be via an email. I believe an email was sent to, I'm not sure if it was the chair, if it was John Pye, but we can arrange for an email to be sent to all members of this committee if you want, when there's a shareholder board meeting. I think most of the meetings would be remote, so maybe easier for you to attend. And sorry, I forgot to explain the issue about the formal meeting. When I said formal meetings, it was really to do with the definition in legislation, not a committee as this. So that's why I was trying to explain that it can be held remotely, and I suppose that's maybe easier for everyone to attend.
So thanks for that answer. So I think it would be useful if we were just sort of advised of when the meetings were coming up, and then we could decide individually. The only concern I have, and this is more my comment, is it feels, and it follows really on from Graham's question about the formal way in which we sort of provide ourselves with that assurance, because we could individually decide, oh, there's a meeting next week of the committee, one of us turns up, but equally we could be sitting here in a year's time and none of us have been to any of those meetings, and it's not clear to me at the moment, those reports that will come to the committee, how we get the assurance from that. So I'm just feeling a little bit uncomfortable that we're lacking a more formal way in which we can give that assurance.
Well, I've got that noted. That's good.
Chair, there we are. Having gone through the improvement programme within our own council, and there's been a number of questions brought up about different companies. Do you need them? If you've got procurement, do you really need to have a separate company? Are you trying to set up SPVs that will have a definite close down? The representation on those boards and the potential conflicts of interest that exist between members and so forth. So there's quite a mixture of complex and rather concerning elements that you've got to deal with. And I just wonder, I appreciate I'm new to the committee, so I don't know the process, but I'd be very interested to know how you're working through all those issues that SIPF have brought up in our own case and applying more generally right the way across local authorities.
Okay, can I try and, well, that's why I did the bit at the beginning about how long we've been on this journey. And I agree with the sentiment that we need to be clearer. But I mean, whether the combined authority decides to have this company or that company is not us. We're about the how, And the decisions, it's for overview and scrutiny and others to decide whether the decisions were appropriate. So it's focusing on the how. Now that we have a shareholder board, I think we can now regularise it a bit. That I think we should ask for an annual report of the activities of the board, with including background with that report on what the companies are, etc. And as the mayor's only chaired his first board, we could put that in a year's time. And I think we should ask the shareholder board secretariat, as a matter of routine, to notify all members on the Audit and Governance Committee. And if somebody would like to say, yes, I'll definitely attend one, and feedback to us, would anybody like to put their hand up? Okay, so Andy Coles, you'll attend one, the first one, next one it appears that you can get to, and then if you let the secretariat know, you can give us an oral feedback at the time. Does that answer those points raised by members? Okay, so it might not even be this. So the end of this municipal year, we could ask for a first report from the shareholder board and get into, are we comfortable with that? Okay, thank you. I think that's very good progress, thanks. And now we get to item 8, the improvement framework. How are we doing? Yes. Angela's going to introduce. And we are requested mainly to consider and note how work is proceeding. Unfortunately, the external auditor wasn't able to join us today, and I know Angela will be talking to him later. But for those, particularly those who are new, we got the first sign at our March meeting of positive green shoots coming from all the work that's going on. And at that time, the external auditor was much less Delphic than he'd been for the previous year. He wouldn't commit himself, but it was a more positive statement that he provided us with. So from that springboard, Angela's going to bring us up to date.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, first of all, I think it was really useful to meet yesterday so that we could give some context and background at the induction, particularly for new members. And I'm very happy if new members want some more detail to meet separately with you, because I'm conscious we've been on this journey now a few months. So I'm very happy to meet with you. Chair, just before I give an update on the progress so far, pulling out the key points, one of the things that was raised yesterday in the purpose set out in paragraph 1.2 is that the committee should assure itself that the improvement framework, and the wording we set out was will. And Chair, the committee asked yesterday at the induction that we should change that to should. So I just wanted to put that on and raise that in terms of consideration today. But Chair, if I can take the committee through just a brief update. You've obviously had the report and the appendices, but Chair, it would be helpful just to note the progress against the improvement areas that are set out in Appendix 1. They are key, and it's an important journey that we're on. In terms of governance and decision making, the changes to the Constitution to strengthen the governance arrangements are being embedded, and there's evidence of that from some of the items and matters that are being discussed this morning. An induction programme for members is being rolled out. We did the audit and governance induction yesterday, and Chair, as you've already shared, the CA board induction is to take place on the 22nd of June. In terms of the organisation's approach, Directorate business plans were finalised in April as requested by the interim chief executive, and that now gives us that golden thread, that key golden thread between our priorities, deliverables, but also individual objectives. And the vast majority of staff have had their individual objectives set by the target date of the end of April. And Chair, just to note, this is the first cycle of business planning across the Combined Authority since its establishment, and it's a key building block, and we will take the learning from this first year forward. In terms of programme delivery, the second key area of concern and focus, the single assurance framework's being developed, as you've heard earlier on today's agenda. And in the discussion with DULUC, our quarterly DULUC meeting earlier this week, which I will come back to, we raised in that meeting that we would welcome their support both in its development but also sign off, and they are a key stakeholder in this. It's seen as good practice by the Independent Improvement Board, and it's useful that in terms of our focus on partnership working, that the external working group consists of officers from across the local authorities, which is again positive. Moving on to the procurement of services, Chair, that's already been discussed this morning on the agenda with regards to the outcome of the review and recommendations by PwC. In terms of partnership working, there is now growing evidence that collaboration and partnership working is being developed and embedded more deeply, and that the CA is now actively involved and participates with the Secretary of State and senior officers as part of the M10 group of metropolitan combined authorities. The CMT, the new CMT, have met with the senior leadership teams of constituent member authorities. And again, Chair, some very positive messages have come out that are set out in the report. In terms of capacity, capability and culture, all key elements to drive through the improvement that's required. The permanent executive directors are in place, the head of policy, and now the new chief executive has started. And we are also recruiting support for the mayoral office that we know has not been in place previously. The values are now built into recruitment appraisals and into our HR policies. And a good workshop was held in May to help define the behaviours. There is a third staff survey that is live to gauge how staff are feeling and their engagement. A third staff conference is due to take place next week, and the induction programme is live now for all staff who are starting with the Combined Authority. Moving on to the conclusion of the Code of Conduct investigation, the investigation will hopefully be concluded by early June, and their standards training has been given in anticipation of the need to fulfil that role. I'll come back to the improvement plan, Chair, when I give you an update in terms of what has been agreed by the board. In terms of the Independent Improvement Board, and one key area of focus is how we engage with them. The IIB has now met twice since the induction day in January. They continue to meet with the CA board. Indeed, they've met with the chair of this committee and overview and scrutiny and other key stakeholders. And CMT attended the last IIB to share who they were, but also their focus and areas of drive and ambition. The agendas and notes are shared with the IIB in advance, and all actions are logged. And the chair has identified that whilst there is more to do, good progress is being made. And the chair has written to the CA board and audit and governance on their areas of assurance and areas for further focus. And that is attached to the report as Appendix 3. The next meeting of the IIB is to take place in July, and it is proposed that the full CA board will be asked to join that meeting with CMT. So that will be a very strong, powerful meeting. And hopefully the new chair will also be present. And Chair, there is now a replacement to Lord Kerslake that has been identified, but the interim chief exec, out of courtesy, wants to speak to the outgoing acting chair. So whereas we thought that announcement might be made and I would be able to share that with you today, that will be announced on Monday of next week. And Chair, that will be circulated to members of this committee. Just moving now, Chair, on to the new reframed improvement plan, which is attached as Appendix 2, that this committee is asked to note. It focuses on the key areas of concern. And for each of those key areas, we've identified very clearly the key source, the specific concerns that have been raised by the external auditor, and indeed the best value notice. But as asked of us by DULUC, we have identified what those outcomes will be, so what will be different and how we are going to deliver and achieve that. The IIB have specifically asked that if additional concerns are identified, that then the plan is revised, and Chair, we will do that through the normal governance that is in place. CMT members, as identified on the plan, have been key in leading the development of the plan, but also own the activity that needs to be delivered. And an improvement group, as with the previous phase, is in place, and that is chaired by Nick Bell, so that any issues, risks and dependencies can be resolved. The IIB has asked specifically for a RAG rating to be used, and Chair, we will use this so we consistently report progress to all boards and committees. And finally, Chair, what I would want to update the committee on is that we are in regular contact with IIB members, DULUC colleagues, the LGA, and other key stakeholders. And Chair, as you shared earlier, I will be meeting with the external auditor to update him and answer any further questions. And earlier this week, we had a positive meeting with DULUC colleagues on the progress to date and the agreed future plans. And it was helpful that Gordon Mitchell, as outgoing Chief Executive, was present, and also Rob Bridge, the new Chief Executive, was present. And although they have not written down yet their observations, we came away believing that it was positive and constructive in the journey and progress that we are making. So, Chair, that is what I want to share as an update for the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Angela. Right. Questions, comments?
More comments than questions, but first of all, I just wanted to say I do like the format of, I might get the right appendix number, the Appendix 2, starting with the identifying the outcome and then the actions to do that. So I think that's a very good, clear format, and that's a good approach. Didn't have any detailed comments on those aspects, other than a question about. Well, this actually goes back to the earlier appendix about the whether there are any further plans for staff surveys beyond what's happened to date. The more substantive comment I wanted to make was on the, I know we're only noting the RAG ratings. Obviously, this is a fairly well-established approach. What concerns me is that we've ordinarily RAG ratings tend to have just red, green and amber, and we've sort of got these interim green, amber and amber red, and I'm a little concerned that provides less clarity. The better approach I think I've seen is where you have red, amber, and green, but then a trend, so you know whether something, it may be amber today, but there's a danger that it's worsening. The other question I've got, looking at the definitions there, is, and this is reflecting. So in my day job, I get regularly lots of project reports from different project managers, and I have to try and work out which ones I need to be worried about. And the key thing there is getting consistency across those ratings, because one person's red, maybe another person's amber, and if I read, I'm concerned at the moment the definitions are quite subjective. So, for example, there's only the green amber one talks about risk, and then it doesn't talks about risk and doesn't sort of quantify that. In amber, we're talking about feasible, and green amber is probable. Those terms are quite open to interpretation. So one person's feasible could be another person's probable, and vice versa. And I wonder whether we just need to tighten up those definitions a little bit to make sure, and maybe the other part, because sometimes it's not easy to quantify those things, at least for the people who are doing the ratings, making sure you've got some way of ensuring that sort of consistency across the group that are providing them.
Thank you. If I can pick up just an initial comment on that one, and then Angela may wish to add a bit more detail. I think it's a very valid comment, actually, in terms of making sure that we've got absolute clarity in relation to what the red, the amber and the green have in place, and we certainly go back and review that. I think the thing to bear in mind is through moderation and making sure that everybody's red, amber and green is moderated the same way. I think Angela mentioned previously the improvement group that I chair, and that brings together all of the owners of all the projects here, and that's the opportunity for us to be able to moderate across each area to make sure that one person's amber is the same as another person's amber. So that is already in play, but we will go back and make sure that we've got that definition as tight as we can in relation to what each of them means. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think there's also we don't want to cross thread with the Independent Improvement Board. So I'm sure the comments will be fed back to them, but in the end, they are what they are, and they will be the people who give us advice on the implementation plan. And in useful conversations we had in the previous two meetings, in order not to be double marking, we switched our focus to measuring the progress to satisfying the outside stakeholders, which are the outcomes that you talked of. But that's helpful. Thank you.
And I agree entirely with Mark about the idea of having some sort of trend line. And if you can make all these different green, amber, red work, then fine. But otherwise, I would personally stick to green, amber, and red, which is complicated enough by itself. But more comprehensive questions. I think, Angela, you referred to at the beginning whether we should recommend changing some of the wills to should. Personally, I would leave it as will, in that is much more positive, that the authority will do things rather than should, but it might or might not. Yeah.
It was not in the sense of the plan. This was the sense of our job today, was to say whether or not the work that's going on will satisfy the external stakeholders. And we're not competent to do that.
But we're not competent to do that, and which is why every time I ask the external auditor, is this going to meet your expectations? But if okay, in which case I'll take that back. The comment I did want to make related to the staff survey results, but you mentioned, Angela, that there is another one going out at the moment, that there was clearly from some of the survey undertaken in January, a number of people who weren't entirely happy with the way things were going. Are you confident that that number is getting less and less, and that this next survey, which is due out any time now, will show a significant improvement again?
Thank you for that question. Chair, I would suggest we will bring back to this committee the outcome as part of an update, the progress with the third staff survey, which is currently out. And we're getting the results in. I think it closes over the next few days. In terms of the specific questions, in terms of our staff feeling more confident, I think it's a balance as a mix, as you would expect. I think what we need to continue doing is what we are doing now, which is to engage with staff. We have next week it's called a staff conference in this room, but it's getting staff together to enable them both be engaged in, contribute to, but also hear and understand the journey that we are on. So I can't comment on whether the confidence level has gone up or down. That will come out of the survey itself. But I think, as we've seen in some of the feedback today from what others are observing, they can see those green shoots. They can see through the relationship and the interactions they're having with staff across constituent authorities that staff are more engaged and involved in what we are doing. But Chair, specifically, I think we can bring back to a future meeting what progress has been made in terms of some of those individuals who previously might not have been as confident as others across the organisation.
Right, thank you. Throw a 6 to start. No, just a comment, not a question really, but we obviously came onto this committee when it probably felt like it was at rock bottom. I think it was, it was hard to go back to, my council that I'm representing, to give my report without sounding, absolutely full of doom and gloom and very negative. So I think from that point, the amount of work, the amount of time that we've discussed it, but the amount of work that's clearly gone into this, it's obviously, it shows, it's very welcome, and it feels nice to actually. I think we can see the positive side coming through now. I think the code of conduct thing, we need to get, to have that's over and done with. I think everybody will welcome that. We can get down to business like we should be doing, and put it behind us. And I think it's great that it feels that we're actually making good progress. So I just wanted to add a positive comment.
I didn't do my. I'll do it again. So don't see any more comments. Could we, before I try and round off, could we go to page 41 of 193, which is the bottom of the first report from the Independent Improvements Board? And if you go to paragraph 4, which talks about stability in line with good practice in ONS and A&G membership, and the need to provide ONS and AAG members to help them understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Well, the training started yesterday, and I encourage you to all look at the recording of the meeting. But the question of stability and membership is a more difficult challenge. And there may be other ways of doing it. And we've also got, as we discussed earlier in the meeting, about independent membership and the CIPFA view that there should be 2 independent members on local government audit committees. I've talked over coffee with Nick, and he's undertaken, if members are happy, to do some analysis of audit committees across the sector, because we're all faced with the same challenges in the sense of, this year we were hoping that we'd get more, we wouldn't have such a big turnover, but you get the two things of the election outcomes and then this juju, which I don't understand, which is the political balancing, which has changed. We lost, I think, one of the members. That's nothing to do with the individuals, but it's the nature of the moving parts of the problem. So I don't think it's part of Angela's work necessarily. I'll look for advice, but I would like the executives to take on the task of doing a run through on the various ways in which combined authorities deal with the problem, so we can look and whether we come with a recommendation or whether that might lead to a workshop or where we can discuss it. But I think with the hook of the Independent Improvement Board latching on to this, and then there's this aligned issue, which I've always prefaced really, is that we are outside the business as members of this committee. And I've never been on a audit committee hitherto where there wasn't somebody around the table within the committee rather than the advisors who was closer to the business. So getting texture, and we get it with the shareholders board. That's an opportunity for texture. But so there's quite a few challenges which we should use this opportunity, I think, if members are supportive, to have a thoroughly good shake around and see if there's other improvements that can be made. Are we happy to do that? Okay. Thank you. And you're happy to do it. And I'll leave timing for you to come to give me advice. So generally, I think finishing where Steve Corney was, that the positive shoots that we saw in March are continuing, and that's the sense we get. I think it would be good for the next meeting to have the external auditor with us as well. So if we could arrange that, and we might be able to make a firmer view on the purposes, which included ensuring ourselves that work is on track. But from what we know at the moment, and until we see perhaps another report from the Independent Improvement Board, the wind is in the right direction, and the good things that we saw last time are continuing. And we are give our support, I'm sure, to all the people who are doing this hard work to make that happen. Are we, is that, yeah, okay, I take note of that. Sorry, now, it's 10 to 12, so we've got 1 hour 10 if we can possibly squeeze in the rest of it. I think we have two choices. We can either no, I can't. I'm just trying to see. There's some that we just can't avoid doing. Can I put the corporate risk register to the end so that if we don't have enough time, we'll put you up front next month? And I see a man who's happy with that. So we could do the number 9 corporate performance report, and we have Jules. Sorry.
Chair, maybe I'm not as young a man as I was to.
Oh yes, okay. That's all right. Well, you're not formally a member, so we're still quorate.
All right.
No. I mean, neither am I, but I'm coping so far. But if anybody, no, are we happy to continue? Or would you like 5 minutes? Just plough on? Okay. Right. So, let me get back to where I was. The corporate performance report. Jules has joined us. This is her first attempt and her first interaction with us. And we are asked to review and assess the plans under development. And we had a discussion about whether or not we are approving the plans, but Jules will take us through it. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. The policy context for this piece of work is the English Devolution Accountability Framework, which was published in March. This framework provides guidance to mayoral combined authorities and other institutions with devolved powers, and is structured around 3 key forms of accountability: local scrutiny and checks and balances, accountability to the public, and accountability to the UK government. Regarding local scrutiny, the framework states that an overview and scrutiny committee's role is to review and scrutinise the institution's decisions, whether planned, underway, or implemented, and to make reports and recommendations to the authority on the discharge of its functions and on matters that affect the authority's area or residents. The Combined Authority Board currently receives performance information as part of the performance review element of the improvement plan. As part of that plan, a performance management framework and quarterly corporate performance reports are in development. We are asking this committee to review, assess, and approve our plans, although in discussions with the chair, that might be not appropriate to ask for approval here. Section 2 of the report sets out how we propose to develop an interim performance management framework to be presented to Overview and Scrutiny Committee and Combined Authority Board in July, a full performance management framework to be presented in September, and quarterly performance reports thereafter. Our intention is that the Combined Authority's corporate performance reports will contain a broad range of information, including a balanced scorecard of corporate key performance indicators and a narrative report on our most complex projects, as well as the information currently contained in the Improvement Programme Highlight Report. We are proposing to come back to this committee in November to enable members to review this performance management process. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Only allows one of us to speak at any one time. Thank you very much, Jules. Comments, members?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the report. I'm a little bit sceptical sometimes of KPIs and their presentation about how legible they are and how understandable they might be. And I'm just wondering if you've thought you might want to do a bit of training to interpret things as you get to the end of this programme. I can imagine it being somewhat difficult to illustrate all the KPIs that are being measured in an effective way that this committee can grasp and see where issues will arise. So I'm just wondering if that's part of your plan.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I'm familiar with the difficulties that there can be in actually making that information accessible to a broad range of different stakeholders. And we are proposing to set up a workshop with Overview and Scrutiny Committee in July, where we would include some training and indeed some co-production of how we present that information. So we would be very interested in extending that to audit and governance if that would be of interest.
So certainly for me, just to answer that last question, I think that would be useful. I think and I think sometimes it's also not just the interpretation, but maybe the rationale behind how they've been defined. Because it's always, it's critical to get the right KPIs, and in particular, I think, when it comes to KPI definition, it's much easier to come up with lagging KPIs than leading KPIs, but unfortunately lagging KPIs tell you things have gone wrong, not that something might be about to go wrong. The one question I did have was, so I understand it, and this is in paragraph 3.3, it talks about putting together this, the interim sort of arrangements before the full sort of framework is developed. I understand the rationale behind that, and that makes sense. And that paragraph suggests that it'll enable members to scrutinise performance data quicker. I'm just wondering if you've also thought about the how you can get a feedback mechanism to then sort of refine that when you come to the full sort of plan.
Thank you. Yes. So in that report, the intention is that we ask for comments about how the information is presented and how useful it is, so that we can have that feedback loop. Indeed, not just at that meeting, but it'll be an iterative process as we develop this reporting throughout the year.
Any other? Okay. So this workshop in July, you're saying, would be available to A&G members as well. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that would be possible. I don't know whether Nick wants to add anything to that.
I think if I may, that would be an excellent idea. If Audit and Governance Committee members are keen to go along to that, we'll make sure that you've got the invite. If there's any problem in terms of the day and the date of that, I'm sure that we could even probably put on a separate event if we wanted to, Jules, on that, couldn't we?
Well, let's try and not make too many more events. I think if there's an invitation to members, it seems to me that if I often try and look back and say, well, why didn't I see where we are coming? And one indicator was that we were not aware of was the number of vacancies in the organisation, 30% or 35%. So it seems to me that given the role of the Audit and Governance Committee, it's trying to find insights which tell us about the governance arrangements. We would love all the performance of the outputs of the combined authority to be perfect, but that's not our remit. Our remit are the processes for producing the outputs appropriate. So we do need indicators, rather like on the procurement issue, that tell us that the system is healthy, which is separate from we've spent N million on whatever we've done. So I think we probably could add some value, and I would encourage members when we have the invitation. Do you have a date for it now? Do you know the date of it?
The date hasn't yet been set, so that gives opportunity to make it work.
So I think that's a welcome development, and you're going to come back to us formally in November to report back on how things have gone. Do we have any other? I don't think we have any other substantive comments at this stage, but I think we welcome the journey that you're on, and I think it will be helpful for some of us to find time to be there, so that we can make sure that understanding how the governance systems work, as opposed to the inside the particular activities, is an insight that we can then use as a committee. Thanks very much, Jules. Okay. So we've done the procurement, we've deferred that. So we go to item 12, page 108 in the pack, and Edwina, you're going to introduce.
Thank you, Chair. So the report before this committee makes three recommendations. One is to establish a subcommittee, and one is to establish a hearing panel, which is a subcommittee as well. And the final one is to authorize the monitoring officer, myself, to accept changes to membership of those subcommittees. The Constitution empowers you as a committee to set up subcommittees who can basically, sorry, I'm just trying to find the right wording in the Constitution so I'm not misquoting the Constitution. But effectively, it's sub-delegating your functions to another smaller committee, which comes out of this main committee. And some of the things that subcommittee can do will be to maybe deep dive into matters that you want to look at, to conduct hearing panels when there is an allegation of a breach of the code of conduct. That's what this report is about. It's open to this committee to approve the recommendations. If there are names available for the hearings panel, it will be quite welcome, so we can go back today as the Democratic Services and start to do the administrative work behind that. The report recommends that there are 4 members, so 1 from each political party and an independent person to chair that subcommittee. So that's the end of what I wanted to say, but I am open to questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Edwina. And this panel is an enabler for one of the outstanding items on the improvement journey. So do we have any comments on the recommendation of establishing a 4-person panel with 3-party representation and an independent chair? Are we happy with that?
I'm happy with that. I just wanted to clarify with 4 people, 1 from each of the main parties plus an independent chair, that it's very then dependent on that individual being available. So can we appoint substitutes or spares, or an order of you go for this person first and then second and third? How would that work?
Thank you. Unfortunately, this committee has just 1 independent person. And the reason for well, maybe I shouldn't say unfortunate. What I mean is if you have a sub-panel, there can only be 1 independent person on the panel, who is JP. But with regard to subs, that you can have subs for the political members. Yeah.
Well, we know it's going to be Simon Smith. If we could, are you able to proffer names today, the other 2 parties, or do you need to go and have a discussion about it?
Just one other point, which was if someone was conflicted as a result of that inquiry and needed to excuse themselves, then clearly there would need to be some form of substitution process in place. I think, unless I'm mistaken, that there would have to be that anyway for the process to work.
Thank you. Perhaps if I could just ask Edwina for clarification, but my understanding in relation to this is that you're right, there would need to be a substitute, but the substitute would need to also be a member of this committee, I think is a critical issue. That's my understanding, Edwina, that any substitute on that subcommittee would also need to be a member of this committee. So I think rather.
Okay, so we have 2 reasons for substitution: is availability and potential conflict. And I just have to be my diary. We have to choose a date that suits my diary, or my diary has to suit the date, one or the other.
Would it be prudent to have this, if we go down the route of the substitute, rather than that being, so if we've got the main attendees here now, we've all got a substitute that doesn't come very often, potentially. So maybe the substitute should be made up of the actual main group as opposed to substitutes, if that makes sense. Because you might, the only issue I'm sort of thinking you might end up having a substitute that doesn't attend that often and would be coming in quite in the dark almost.
Well, this conversation just shows how even the simplest thing is not simple. If I interpret it right, it should be a main member of the committee. Is that what you said?
Ideally, but of course that isn't possible with the Labour group at the present time. So therefore, they would, I think, have to have a substitute member, if that makes sense. I think the other groups could have a main member of this committee as a substitute.
Okay. Right. We agree we should have a panel. We agree that it should be 4, and but we're a bit, and we agree that it can have a substitute. How do we get the other bit?
Well, if Simon is the rep for Labour, is that right? Then I'm happy to be the rep for Lib Dems with Mark and Jeff, who I think are the other two Lib Dems on this group, as spares rather than substitutes, so they're not confused. Such that if I can't do a date or I'm conflicted in any way, I can call on one of them.
Are the Conservatives able to make such a pronouncement now, or do they need to go in a huddle? I think Councillor... No, I mean, if we can do it now, and Andy, you're going to put your hand up.
Am I? Oh, I'm putting my hand up. Yes, very good, John.
Okay, so we've got three principal names, and then we'll negotiate via the principal if there needs to be a substitute or alternate. Okay? All right. Can you make all that into the minutes make sense? Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. We have flying information items 13, 14 and 15, and Dan from RSM to talk to us about the internal audit opinion, the progress report and the plan for the future. All yours, Dan.
There we go. Is that working? It is. Thank you, Chair. So yes, the first paper is the annual internal audit opinion for 22-23. The opinion itself is on page 114 of your pack. It's a qualified opinion. You can see on page 122 or Appendix A of this document the four opinions that I've got open to me. Two of those being positive, two of those being negative. Now, this isn't a surprise to the committee. I've mentioned this at previous meetings that given the outcome of some of our work to date, we were likely to be heading towards a second consecutive year of a qualified opinion on the risk management, governance, internal control arrangements. The remainder of the report then obviously goes into all of the detail, but I think the important part, so if you look at sort of pages 115 onwards, that explains the work that we've undertaken that informs the opinion. So in summary, we've undertaken one advisory review that was on data protection that identified some significant weaknesses in the control framework. We've issued 5 partial assurance opinions, 1 reasonable assurance and 1 reasonable progress. I've also mentioned some of the areas where we sort of haven't covered but had issued negative opinions in the prior year. So the culmination of all of that work that I've sort of listed in that section headed up factors and findings which have informed the opinion obviously contribute to the overarching opinion. I've also referenced obviously the best value notice, and I'm conscious in terms of the timing, the improvement plan work, and a lot of the agenda that we've already heard today and the progress that's being made there. And you will note later on in the agenda we have got 2 audits planned in the 23-24 programme that focus specifically on that improvement plan. So I'm hopeful that obviously when we get to that work, we can recognise some of the positive messages that we've heard today through the wider agenda and the wider papers. But that's obviously more of a forward-looking opinion in terms of the next following financial year. So I've suggested just at page 118, the areas that I think should be considered for flowing through to the annual governance statement, which obviously this committee will have sight of. And again, I think it's just pertinent, I know it's within the report, but just to mention just on the bottom of page 120, the potential for sort of conflicts of interest through some wider work that we've been commissioned to undertake, but I'm satisfied that they haven't presented a conflict in terms of me being able to provide that opinion, but nonetheless, for full transparency, that's contained within the report. And it's obviously a requirement of any internal audit service to meet the internal auditing standards. Just confirmation there that we continue to do that. And Appendix B, that's just the summary of the work that we've performed in 22-23, the respective assurance opinions, and the number and priority of management actions that have been agreed. So I'm happy, Chair, to sort of pause at that point and take any questions.
So we are asked to comment and note on this report. So are there comments?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering about cybersecurity. I appreciate there's some headlines in this that don't perhaps go into that detail, but following on from the Move It attack and vulnerabilities to certain local authorities, does that feature within your programme?
There is another IT review scheduled in for the 23-24 programme, the scope of which is yet to be determined, but it can absolutely be a discussion that we have at that scoping stage to say, should we, for example, be looking at the Cyber Essentials framework, which the government have laid out certain good practice guidelines that they expect any organisation to follow in relation to their cyber defences. So we've got accredited individuals within our firm that can actually do that Cyber Essentials accreditation. So we can certainly have those conversations. No, it wasn't specifically in the 22-23, no.
Just briefly, if I may, in terms of cybersecurity, you're absolutely right. It's a key issue for us. Through our Executive Information Security group, we are constantly reviewing that. And we've had the award of £75,000 as well recently from the government to focus on improving our cybersecurity as well, which we're now in the process through our provider, Socketum, of actually implementing through there. So again, it is something that we're taking very, very seriously and will, I'm sure, form part of the internal audit and the IT controls this year.
Any other comments? No, well, it's thank you, Dan, for that. It's unwelcome, but the candor is important. And when you and I have discussed about the how common it is to have a qualified opinion and to have two qualified opinions in succession, Lady Bracknell would not be pleased. But it's this sort of evidence is a basis on which improvement can rise, isn't it? And let us hope that with all the effort that is going on right across the piece, that we don't have a conversation like this next year. But thank you. That was the opinion. Now it's the progress report.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the key messages, just run through those. So since the last meeting, 2 further final reports relating to the 22-23 plan have been issued. 2 draft reports remain from the 22-23 programme. We're working with officers to finalise the responses to those. They should both be coming through to your July meeting. Obviously, another key message, I've just presented that opinion, and I'm also coming on to talk about the 23-24 plan. I think just a couple of things that I would say in terms of sort of section 2 of the report, and specifically The subsidiary companies deep dive review, actually, we looked at sort of the overarching arrangements for subsidiary companies in the prior year, in 21-22, and that was a minimal assurance opinion. So actually, in terms of some direction of travel, that there is some positive news here. I appreciate that we've targeted specifically and done a deep dive on 2 of the subsidiary companies, but notwithstanding the fact that the prior year that was actually a minimal assurance opinion. So there's some positive messages coming out there. At the same time, on the IT general controls review, you will note we've got a high priority action in there around officers that have either moved position and their respective access not being revoked or transferred in a timely manner, and likewise on a sample of leavers that we also took. There were no leavers that hadn't had their access revoked, but it was the timeliness issue that we felt needed to be addressed. So clearly we've agreed an action there with officers, and likewise there's 5 further medium priority actions on that general controls review. Again, for context for some of the new members to the committee, this was again a minimal assurance opinion in the prior year, so in 21-22. So whilst still it's a negative opinion, there have been some improvements. But I wouldn't want to underplay the fact we're still saying there needs to be further work to improve the general IT control environment. So I think that was it, Chair. I mean, other than perhaps just mentioning at Appendix B, I know we're about to come on to the internal audit plan for next year, but what Appendix B does within the progress report is just cites the committee on sort of where we are. So we've already commenced one of those 23-24 reviews. Scopes are being agreed for all of the remaining reviews, but all have been scheduled in terms of my team. We've allocated the resources, so we're working through the scopes now with lead officers to undertake the 23-24 programme, and obviously we'll come back through to the committee with when we finalise respective reports.
Are there any? We're asked to note and comment on the progress report.
Yes, so Appendix A, it's useful, I guess, in terms of I can see how many actions have been raised. I assume there's obviously a detailed action list behind that. I just wonder if that's something that whether or not that's appropriate to be shared with members just for information. I'm not suggesting we have a discussion, but it gives us a better idea of, let's say, the more than the numbers, just what actions need to be taken. The other thing related to that, clearly you've prioritised them, but I guess also there are deadlines or target dates or something behind that as well. So I think I'd also be interested as we work through you give us progress updates as to how that is going, and for example, whether those dates have been hit or whether anything is missing.
I mean, if I may, just in response, so on the latter point, we do actually, one of the requirements to meet the internal auditing standards is you have to have an element of follow-up coverage within your plan. So we randomly select a sample of actions that officers are saying have been implemented. We will then independently corroborate that through, well, prove it, show me the evidence. So that follow-up review actually concluded with reasonable progress. So in our terminology, a positive opinion. So again, there's some more sort of positive messages coming through there. I think I'm right in saying as well, Rob, that you do have a recommendation stroke action tracker that provides exactly the sort of detail that you've referenced there, Councillor.
Thank you for me. Absolutely. I think it's Rob, myself, maintain that tracker, and we report it to this committee on a regular basis. So this committee had oversight of that in its March meeting, and it will get it again at its 7th of July meeting. So the next meeting that comes around, it will have that latest update in terms of the tracker. That's got every single action on there, and particularly those that are potentially delayed around that. So you will get oversight of that.
Thank you, Dan. With that one comment, I think we can move on to looking forward.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely. And I wasn't going to spend a huge amount of time on this document because the committee had seen this previously. Just a quick recap. So, I mean, the document includes the sort of background information in terms of how we go about determining potential areas for coverage. At your March meeting, I recall we had a long list of potential areas that had been discussed with respective officers, and we've worked closely with Nick to prioritise that list, and that in effect is what you see in section 2, so starting on page 140 of your pack. So those are the reviews that we've agreed. I think in response to an earlier question just around the sort of assurance framework and should we be linking our coverage, so what you can absolutely see there is that we have linked and indeed driven our coverage from some of the strategic risks that officers feel are being managed. And so in my mind, any sort of decent internal audit plan is a risk-driven plan, so it will absolutely be linked to that. I think the only reason why we haven't placed great emphasis on the assurance framework previously, and I think Jodie referenced it was because it had some deficiencies. So I think once we're satisfied that that new framework is in place, then we will start to coordinate both the risk register and indeed correlate that across the assurance framework. So hopefully that provides clarity for members. I think the only other thing, again, I would just say for the new members, perhaps just to point out at Appendix B, hopefully it's self-explanatory, but we've delivered 2 full years of internal audit coverage. But what we're trying to do in Appendix B is have the backward look to say, where have we provided you with some independent assurance on the respective auditable area? And then likewise, there's sort of a forward-looking, as much as we've got the 23-24 programme, the latest thinking around, well, what might the next couple of years look like after that? Final comment from me is this plan should remain flexible. So we're holding regular meetings with Nick. If there's an emerging risk, we will either add to this or remove one of these areas and bring in the emerging risk area if we agree that internal audit is the right assurance provider in that area.
Thank you, Dan. I just wanted to say, obviously, from a mayoral point of view, it sounds great. I'm really pleased to see it. As I say, I'm sitting back and enjoying the last 2.5 hours. I feel I've learned quite a lot about what's happening within my own organisation. In regard to an internal audit plan, I guess it's an open question. It's to everybody really. Is there a role here for the mayor to be asked directly about what should be being audited? Because I wish somebody had asked me a long time ago. And I may well have actually pointed on many of these things, speaking as somebody whose IT systems once were disappeared and I couldn't find any. It's a long time ago, hasn't happened since, I have to say, but taking it upon myself to then speak to Soccertim and saying, how can my whole files just disappear and be moved and with no explanation? That's how bad it was. And unfortunately, I didn't have a way to articulate my concern in the past. I don't have that problem now because I have people who listen to me, and that's really important and I feel supported. And this I'm really, really happy to see. But thinking back on it, is there a role for an internal auditor to come and actually speak to a mayor in terms of a combined authority, just to check in with them as a political representative of the board? It may also, to be honest, a question that could be put to the board. But I just asked that question because seeing it now, I'm really pleased it's going to happen like it is. And I thank you for all of you for embracing it, and also for the officers bringing it to the table. But I just want to acknowledge I wasn't asked about this. I'm very happy with it, but should I have been?
Thank you. I think there's a difference probably between what's required via legislation and what good practice should be, if I may. So I think on a purely legislative basis, it's the Audit and Governance Committee that effectively dictates the internal audit plan and has to have the internal audit plan approved at that committee. I think in terms of good practice, I think you raise a very valuable point there, if I may. So, I think that we ought to make sure, and apologies if it's not happened in the past, that actually we are taking the views of all of the key members of the board and wider, on track when we're considering the key areas and the key issues that that we include in the internal audit plan. It's very much driven by risk management and very much driven by the risk register. And certainly the risk register is something that we'll be sharing fairly regularly as well with myself and with the board to ensure that we've got the right risks in there. So again, that's probably an opportunity for you to be able to influence what comes in there. While obviously, as I say, on a pure legislative basis, the Audit and Governance Committee is the committee that actually has to be the one to which internal audit reports and the one that ultimately determines the contents of the internal audit plan. But I'll make sure that we've got mechanisms in place to make sure that so yourself and all of the senior members of the board and the authority as well have that ability to be able to comment.
Thank you. I got one question before we are noting today. The timings. I mean, there's always the challenge, isn't there, that these are back-end loaded in a year. I was just wondering, we've got one starting in February 24, January 24, and deadlines of March and May 24. How comfortable are we that this is manageable?
If I may, Chair, sorry, so page 133 is probably of your pack is probably the most up to date. So when we originally pulled that strategy together, that may have had months in there. What we've done in the progress report is that reflects some of the latest discussions and timing. So we've got one review underway. We've got a further audit commencing in July and one in August, one in September, and a couple in September, and so on. So I think the challenge that we've got with some of these areas is because they've been subject to audit in the current year's programme and they've got actions with implementation dates, there are some of these where we don't want to come in too early because we want to assess the progress that's been made with last year's actions as well as the current year's scope points. So I think what we've got here is a pragmatic. So with an absolute blank sheet of paper, we would probably have wanted sort of to have undertaken more work already. You know, we'd have started some work in April and May, but we just haven't. I think, given some of the issues that I've mentioned, sort of been in quite in that position. But this is certainly a better profile. I think the challenge will be for the committee to sort of keep an eye on this and ensure that we do deliver to this timeline, because actually, if you compare this timeline to the last couple of years, what there has been in the last couple of years is slippage. So I think that would be quite a good role for the committee to seek to understand robustly why, if between ourselves and officers we do see slippage in year, and it's not a very valid reason for any slippage.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that. So we note the next response to the point raised by the Mayor. We've noted the insights you've given us, and we'd like to have a close look at progress versus target progress in our September meeting. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I don't think risk management's going to escape, but you'll be later. Right, so the next item is item 16, which is the revisions to scheme of delegation. And we are asked to review the suggested update and provide recommendations to the board.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's this is in given the Audit Governance Committee's responsibility as custodians of the Constitution, the report stems from a number of things, some of which you've heard about today. So, coming from the procurement review, coming from the work we've been doing on the single assurance framework, coming from the reports of the IIB in terms of timeliness of decisions, coming from requests by constituent councils in our meetings with them to find a mechanism, if possible, to speed up decision making on key areas, and coming indeed from the board itself when we've reported in terms of some of the slippage that has taken place in relation to our programmes, particularly from the time that they reach inception to the time when we can actually get a decision to move forward and execute them. So it comes from a number of different areas, and the proposals in terms of changes aim to strike a balance between sufficient speed and flexibility of decision making while also maintaining strong oversight from members, from this committee, from overview scrutiny, and from the board and the thematic committees as well. In terms of pulling the recommendations and the proposals together, we've been very focused around looking at what other male combined authorities do across the country to try and bring in their practice where possible. And you'll see within the report, in terms of each of the proposals, I've tried to identify the rationale for it and whether and where it logs in place in terms of other practice from other male or combined authorities. So within the report itself, there are a number of proposals. The first of which relates to the key decision threshold, which currently stands at £500,000, and a proposal to move that to £1 million, which is consistent with what the other male combined authorities do. And the issue, of course, in terms of key decisions is key decisions need to be notified for 30 days in advance of taking that decision on the forward plan. So therefore, having a higher threshold on that ensures that if required, decisions can be taken in a speedier basis rather than having to have that 30 days notice. I say that it's consistent with other male combined authorities. You'll note then there are two other proposed changes to general delegations to chief officers. And I'll just give an example in relation to potentially to why this is required. I think the issue is at the moment anything that's over £500,000 needs to come back to full board for approval. We've had issues recently, and these have been mentioned indeed at full board itself, in relation to retendering bus contracts. The issue here is that they have to give 90 days notice. However, there can be 60 days from one board to another. It takes 30 days once a procurement has started to actually get the tenders coming in for the new buses. You can quite clearly see how all that time that is available can rapidly be utilised, and that actually we can end up in a situation where we can't actually let those bus contracts in time under the current constitution unless we have special urgency provisions in place. So this is effectively to try and ensure that those contracts that are of less strategic significance in terms of its size, but huge operational significance, we're able to retender rapidly and to move forward in terms of those delegations. But once again, we're retaining there the right, talking about that balance, for the board to say there are some specific requirements, even less than £1 million, it would want still to maintain responsibility for. And of course, the board is the organisation that agrees a medium-term financial plan, and any of these delegations have to already be in the medium-term financial plan anyway to be exercised. Moving beyond that, 2.5 is a similar issue, but is more around the grant fund agreements that we talked about previously, as opposed to purely those procurements coming in there. We're then proposing as well a number of separate delegations that can only be exercised by the Chief Executive Officer rather than other officers, and in consultation with key members, including the Mayor, the Chair of the Relevant Thematic Committee, and the lead member as well, to ensure that there is again strong political oversight and strong member oversight of these decisions. The delegation in particular to the Chief Executive there is, to a degree, it's already partially included within the Constitution under urgency procedures, but effectively it's meaning that the Chief Executive Officer, in situations where there is a requirement for us to act rapidly because we have new money or because there's an urgency issue, has delegated power to be able to approve a business case or need to approve a procurement in relation to those areas. Moving slightly further down, the other key proposed delegations, item 210 is effectively a key contingency one that is in pretty much every single constitution of every single other male combined authority, but not in ours. It basically says that in a situation where something new arises that's not within the purview of any of the existing boards or governance mechanisms of the combined authority, that the Chief Executive can effectively operate in that situation and take a decision, because otherwise it leaves us effectively rudderless. In that situation, of course, Chief Executive would need to talk to the Mayor and others in relation to that, but can then exercise the right to take those decisions where required. 211 basically just puts in place, in terms of the redundancy matters, a firmer delegation than currently exists within the Constitution. Again, it's not overridden by statute, and the Chief Executive needs to bring back anyway retrospective reports to the board in terms of any exit packages of more than £20,000, and that will continue to be the case in those situations. And 212, which is the final one for the Chief Executive, effectively again is around speed of decision making, because actually when we have earmarked funds, at the present time some of these are delegated to officers, some of these are not, but they all have specific requirements behind them and specific areas that they have to be used for. Again, this enables the board, if it wishes, to keep the responsibility to utilise those funds, but where it doesn't require that responsibility, then it falls onto the Chief Executive to be able to apply those funds, rather than having to go back to seek further approval from the board. The final proposals, I won't go into detail in relation to the monitoring officer, are mostly around administrative issues that are common in pretty much all, again, male combined authorities for the monitoring officer. So things like administering the schemes of allowances, making changes as in, when required to the Constitution, from issues that arise in terms of legislation. So again, to make sure that we're meeting our legislative requirements. So those are the proposals. Subject to discussion and debate today, the intent would be to take this forward to the 26th of July main board for approval in terms of any constitutional changes. But as I said previously, because this committee holds responsibility for the Constitution, it would be very, very useful, and you're asking today for discussion and views of the committee in terms of are they willing to take these recommendations forward, would like to see changes. So, Chair, if I could just pause there, if that's okay, and take any comments from the members of the committee.
Thank you, Nick.
There we are. Nick, thank you very much. I'm sure this is covered. It's just in terms of the summary in the report. Is how does a board member challenge you if you've made that decision, you've consulted with them, and you still go ahead with it, and they're unhappy with it? What's the system for call-in, for challenge, for other groups to then challenge that decision post? I don't see the level of detail there. I'm sure it's there.
Thank you. You'll see that on the critical areas where decisions are taken, it requires the production of an officer decision notice. And in requirement, in terms of officer decision notice, that then has to be obviously retrospectively put back to the board as well. So there's certainly a retrospective ability for the board to be able to challenge in relation to that. And it's clearly custom and practice as well for officers to make sure that they are liaising with relevant members of the board and elsewhere before they actually take these decisions. I think it would be highly unusual for officers to take the decisions without first doing that. But again, if it's not sufficiently detailed within the proposed change for the Constitution, it's certainly something I'm happy to go back and look at again to make sure that we've got sufficient detail around those individual areas. But I think it's a custom and practice issue, together with the fact that obviously those ODNs need to be published as well once decisions have been taken.
Thank you, Chair. Just rather nitpicky sort of language point on page 163 of the report, and in paragraph H on the second bullet point, I just thought it'd make it easier to read if decision making were hyphenated, because I read it in a different way, which very much confused me the first time I read that.
Thank you. I'll take that point on board.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of points from me. One a picky one. I'll do that second. The first one, I think I've got. I think a similar concern to Andy, where there's this reference to in consultation with. So what does that really mean? So if it was with the approval of or something like that, I think that's clear. But consultation could be, I've told you I'm doing it, but yeah, I haven't. It doesn't say you have to listen to what the response is from the mayor or whoever it is that you're consulting with. So I think there's a need to maybe tighten. I think there is a need to tighten up the language there so that we're very clear on what is expected of that.
Can you speak up that point first? I think it's I think the issue is that because these are delegations to officers, if we were to say, for instance, you had to have agreement from individuals, they wouldn't be delegations to the officers, they'd be effectively delegations to the members, which is why the word consultation is important there. I think in practice it would be unusual, or should I say even highly unusual, for any officer to ignore the views and the advice in terms of consultation of a set of members coming in there. But because these are delegations to members rather than to officers, you wouldn't normally require the agreement, because otherwise that would be a different form of delegation, effectively the delegation to those individual members in that situation.
Yes, I'm not quite sure what the correct term is, but let me think of a scenario. You said, oh yeah, I emailed the mayor, he didn't reply, it must be okay. It's sort of, is that adequate consultation? Does there have to be a discussion, for example? It's that sort of, does there have to be an audit trail of that consultation, I guess, ultimately?
So again, this is maybe an issue more in terms of custom and practice and actually how people do it through there. Again, I would be surprised if anybody considered that an email that wasn't responded to would be anything like sufficient consultation in that situation. And we would make absolutely certain that all officers who had this ability to utilise this delegation, which is only to chief officers anyway in relation to the first couple of them, understood that actually when you are consulting, consultation is a proper discussion with a response.
Yeah, so again, I'm still just would suggest we just have a reflect on whether it would be useful to explain that. And my picky point is we've got a mixture of, in general, there's reference in the specific constitutional changes of up to £1 million, and then there's at least one reference of not above £1 million. I think for consistency, it might worth be using the same approach all the way through.
Thank you. I'll definitely take that up and reword that. I think it's probably just crept in by mistake. Thank you.
Thank you. That's why I needed Vice Chair. Subject to those comments, are we happy to recommend to the Combined Authority Board, as we're asked to do, that these? I think also I think I welcome the fact that it's not inconsistent with what's going on elsewhere, and it's a sign that nimbleness. You need more nimbleness. So there are a couple of minor editorial points which we'll have taken on board, and Nick will reflect on how consultation is framed in the proposals. Okay. Thank you very much. That's a decision. All right, so I'll take the advice of the risk management officer, and we'll deal with that in July. If we can now move on to the item 17, which is the Audit and Governance Committee work programme, which is, for new members, is the approach we use to try and populate the year ahead and identify or include items where we think it's useful to have a development or training session. Does anybody have any comments? Fresh pairs of eyes?
A couple of comments. In view of the importance and comments earlier about cybersecurity, is it worth us having a separate paper about the vulnerabilities of the authorities' systems and the work that is being undertaken? If necessary, that could be held in private session, but I think it goes beyond the work that Dan and colleagues is doing personally. And then, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I think there's absolutely no problem and it's laudable that the committee want to see that sort of update. So yes, I think we can put that on. We can either circulate it to the committee as a note, or bring it as a formal paper, depending on whether you wish to have an exempt session about it, because obviously we wouldn't want to publicise identified vulnerabilities in our IT framework, or circulate it as to inform the committee in terms of the work that's been going on to address it, including presumably the outcome of the grant-funded work we've grown from government.
Well, I'm happy to take views around the table, and also yours, JP, as to whether that is something which is the responsibility of this committee or not. But
I think it would be worthwhile doing it properly, so we can have a discussion and understanding. Or is there mileage in a development session with a short note in public so that we can understand it? Either timing, when would be a good time? There's never a good.
We can have a look at your work programme and discuss it with our IT service provider, because obviously we'll need to find a time they can do, and it was probably worthwhile doing it after the current round of grant-funded improvement work that's happening, so that we can give you a forward-looking, informed opinion rather than just a backward-looking one.
Any other comments?
Yeah, so one request and one question. So my request is, I note that there was risk appetite training. I just wondered, for those members of the committee who've, like myself, who've joined after that's taken place, whether there is any material that can be shared from that. And the question is, because obviously the first time I've seen this is to understand I see we've got 3 development sessions lined up with topics to be decided. Just wondering what the process or how the decisions are made as to what the next set of topics are for those sessions.
Thanks very much, Mark. Firstly, Chris Bolton will circulate, in fact, to all members and substitutes, the information that is available on risk appetite, because it's always a wonder. And it's tricky stuff, and it's cultural stuff as well. On the question of how do we fill in the development sessions, we sort of pick them up as we go along, because in previous years I've attempted to get an insight from members as to what their skill sets are and what they would like. And I've given up because the return rate, for whatever reason, is never enough to make a view. But I encourage all members, if there's areas in which they feel they would benefit or they think from what they've seen of the committee there'd be benefit, then that's why we have them in the programme. And so either as we discuss business, if you feel that that is something, oh yes, I'd like to know more about that, then when we can't pack the whole diary, but we've got those slots, and that's what they're there for. It's part of this training. I mean, I think we may well have a development session when Nick's done his work on the various audit committee models, which would benefit from a sort of more workshop proposal. But it's a bit early yet to put a date in. So does that answer that? Okay, all right then.
If I could labour the point, as someone who is well, I used to be a training professional, you're going to provide lots of training. I don't know how you've assessed that, how well it's going to be produced, how effective it will be. I'm just wondering whether that should be part of the work programme to review what's been provided to make sure that you're actually meeting the needs of the committee.
Maybe that's helpful. We'll try again. It's a simple thing. Have you been on audit committees? So we've got finance, whatever it is. It's about 6 questions and what would you like? And the fact that the churn is so high, you know, what we did last year, or what we did 2 years ago, I don't think there's anybody from 2 years ago. So it's a balance. And I think as we go through the year, you'll be able to form a more view.
So if I may be more pointed, it's to have an information at the end of the year about how well members of the committee have actually taken up the non-mandatory but necessary sort of training. So we at least know that we have tried to do our best to be adequately informed to fulfil the role. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, well, I think that's probably useful. We already put attendance in our annual report. We can do that as well. Thank you very much, and we'll reflect those changes and comments. And our next meeting, as I now close, is on the 7th of July at 10 o'clock here. And 7 minutes to go because we couldn't have done risk management. So are we happy to reconvene at 1:30?